said it aloud. The best gift would be if you just died. I froze. The words hit the table before I could even register them. My son didn't blink. The room fell silent. My daughter-in-law smiled slightly, expecting me to react, expecting tears or anger. I did not move. I did not speak. I left the table. They assumed I would stay. They assumed I would beg or explain. I walked out anyway. Every step was measured, every breath quiet. But inside, I cataloged every word, every expression. My name is Janet. I am 60 years old. I am a mother. I am a widow. And today, I am standing in the house I built, being treated as if I am nothing. Greetings, my dear friends. Before I share this heartwarming story with you, I want to ask for a small favor. Please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps stories like this be heard. And drop a comment letting me know which state or city you're listening from. It would warm my heart to know how far my voice has traveled. Get comfortable. Happy listening. The Christmas lights glittered faintly outside the window, but inside, the air was sharp, cold, and full of judgment. I had come for a quiet family dinner, dressed modestly to avoid attention, expecting civility at worst, but the words they spat across the table shattered any illusions. My son, usually the peacemaker, sat stiff, frozen, as if he had no control. My daughter-in-law leaned forward, her hand lightly tapping the table, watching for my reaction. The adults around her nodded subtly, confirming the unspoken plan. They would take what they wanted, and I was supposed to remain silent. I held my place, letting their arrogance show itself fully. I asked for water quietly, letting them see the contrast, the old coat, the trembling hands they assumed, the modest purse resting in my lap. They spoke freely about my estate, my possessions, and my future, whispering numbers as if I were invisible. My son's inheritance, my decisions, my life. They discussed all as if it were a commodity, something to calculate, divide, and consume. I let them finish, letting each word land, like a stone thrown in calm water. When they finally paused, satisfied with their presumptions, I rose slowly. The Christmas tree lights reflected on the polished floor. I walked out of the room deliberately, letting the door click behind me. They assumed I would return. They assumed weakness. They were wrong. I would return, but not as they expected. Every gesture, every whispered plan, every condescending glance had been noticed, every word catalogued. The battle had begun, though they didn't know it yet, and as I walked into the hallway, I knew the first move had been made, and the consequences would unfold far beyond their anticipation. I did not sleep that night. I sat in the study with the lights off, listening to the house breathe, replaying every sentence from that table. Morning came quietly. No apologies followed. No calls. That silence confirmed everything. By noon, my son sent a message asking if I had calmed down. No mention of his words. No denial. I put on the same old coat and drove to the bank myself. The manager stood up when he saw me. I asked for the trust files. All of them. My son was listed as beneficiary, my daughter-in-law as advisor. Funding was scheduled to renew after Christmas. I signed nothing. I asked questions instead. Dates, access, authority. Each answer showed how confident they had become without me. I left with copies and went to the office building downtown, the one my name was still engraved on, though no one mentioned it anymore. Security waved me through without checking. Upstairs, the legal floor was quiet. My attorney closed the door and listened without interrupting. When I finished, he did not ask how I felt. He asked what I wanted protected. I told him control mattered more than comfort. He nodded and pulled out documents I had not reviewed in years, clauses they never read, safeguards they ignored. By evening, I received a call from my daughter-in-law. Her voice was polite. She asked if I was coming back for dinner. I said no. She reminded me of family harmony and future planning. I said I was reviewing accounts. Her tone shifted. She asked who told me there were accounts to review. I said no one. The line went quiet. Minutes later, my son called. He spoke carefully, as if every word was being measured. He said Christmas had been stressful. He said things were said out of frustration. He said the family depended on my support. I said nothing. I let him fill the silence. He mentioned mortgages, business expansions, school plans. I asked him one question: who suggested my death as a solution? He did not answer. That told me enough. I ended the call. At sunset, notifications arrived. Account access attempts, password resets, urgent emails marked accidental. They had realized something moved. They just did not know how far. I sat still, phone face down, documents aligned, breathing steady. They thought I had walked away in shame. What they did not understand was that silence had always been how I prepared. And by the time they realized Christmas had cost them more than words, it would already be too late. The next morning, I entered the kitchen quietly. The smell of coffee filled the room, but it could not mask the tension hanging in the air. My daughter-in-law was already there, her hands folded neatly on the counter, waiting. Her eyes flicked toward me with a mixture of expectation and challenge, the same cold calculation from yesterday lingering like a shadow. She didn't greet me. She didn't ask how I slept. She only stared, measuring me, testing boundaries, as if I had no right to exist in that space. My son hovered behind her, silent, hesitant, caught in the web of his own family's scheming. I poured my coffee slowly, deliberately, letting the rich aroma settle between us. She broke the quiet with a question about the house, phrased carefully, like a legal deposit. Are you planning to move anything before the holidays? Her tone implied ownership, authority, a claim to control that was nothing but illusion. I nodded faintly, acknowledging her words without answering them, letting the weight of my presence assert itself silently. She leaned forward, voice sharp now, and said, I need the keys, Janet. I can't wait any longer. The sentence hit like a hammer. The audacity of her demand was breathtaking. I put the cup down, keeping my movements deliberate and slow, watching her expectant face. They had assumed fear, weakness, compliance. Instead, I cataloged everything: the inflection of her voice, the curve of her smirk, the unspoken agreement in my son's hesitation. I could see the game they believed they were winning, the control they assumed over me, and I knew exactly how fragile their confidence was. I walked to the counter, took the keys from their hook, and placed them on the table between us, letting them hover there, useless, powerless. She reached for them reflexively, eyes wide, expecting compliance. I let my hand linger, holding back the final action, forcing her to acknowledge the reality. She had no claim here. My son looked down at the floor, aware, finally, that I had noticed everything. The room felt smaller now, the tension thick, suffocating, because for the first time, she realized she had miscalculated. They had underestimated me, and I had already begun turning the game against them. Every movement she made, every breath she drew, was under my observation. I would not react rashly. I would not give them the satisfaction of confrontation. Instead, I would wait, plan, and let the consequences unfold in a way they could never anticipate. By the time they realized the true power in that room, it would be far too late. And as I sipped my coffee, slow, deliberate, the quiet house seemed to hum with the inevitability of their unraveling, a dark prelude to the reckoning they had set in motion themselves. By evening, the house was quiet again, but the silence was heavy, loaded with unspoken threats and half-formed plans. I watched from the study window as my daughter-in-law and son discussed yesterday's events in whispers, glancing at me as if I were not just in the house, but outside their understanding, invisible yet omnipresent. They believed they could scheme freely, manipulate my son, and divide the assets without interference. But every word, every gesture had been meticulously logged in my mind. I could see the greed in their eyes, the impatience in their hands, and the arrogance in their stance. They assumed their strategy was flawless, but it was brittle, exposed under careful observation. I poured myself another glass of water and let the coolness settle in my palm, grounding me, keeping my movements slow, deliberate, each a silent assertion of control. I replayed the table scene in my head, the laughter that tried to mask contempt, the whispered calculations about my wealth, the casual dismissal of my presence. They had treated me as invisible, dispensable, a spectator at my own life, and I had let them until now. I thought about my son's hesitation, his silence, the subtle way he tried to straddle loyalty to them and recognition of me. That hesitation was a weakness I would exploit, a lever in the coming days. I knew their expectations, that I would plead, cry, or disappear quietly into the shadows. Instead, I began crafting my own plan, unseen and untouchable. Each financial ledger, each legal document, each property detail became a piece on the board they thought they controlled. I cataloged every conversation, every glance, every assumption they made about my passivity. By the time they tried to act openly, their confidence would crumble, replaced by panic and regret. I imagined them seated at the next family dinner, unaware that the tide had already shifted, that their boldness had created the trap, and I held the key to its spring. The quiet night stretched long, each shadow in the hallway a reminder that appearances were deceptive, that power could lie in patience, in observation, in the subtle art of letting your opponent underestimate you. As I closed the blinds and felt the house pulse around me, I allowed a thought to settle. They had begun the war without realizing it, and every move they had made, every plan they believed was secret, had already been captured. I was not the frightened mother or naive observer they assumed. I was the architect of their coming reckoning, and soon the reality of their misjudgment would be undeniable. The following morning, I found them gathered in the living room, pretending normalcy, but the air was charged with unfinished calculations and silent assumptions. My daughter-in-law spoke first, her tone light but sharp, asking if I needed help with the holiday arrangements, as if she had a right to orchestrate every corner of my house. I smiled faintly, slow, deliberate, letting the implied arrogance settle on her shoulders like a weight they hadn't earned. My son hovered behind her, careful not to meet my eyes, but I could feel his awareness trembling beneath the surface, a small rebellion unspoken. I moved around the room with quiet precision, adjusting a vase here, straightening a rug there, each action deliberate, a silent assertion of ownership they refused to acknowledge. She commented casually about future plans, mentioning renovations and potential sales, the words dropping like knives, testing me, probing for weakness. I let them pass. Every syllable, every inflection, every glance was catalogued, filed, and memorized. Then she smiled, thinking she had won, and reached for the keys I had left on the counter yesterday. My hand moved first this time, covering the keys, holding them back, letting her understand without a word. The illusion of control was hers to believe, not to possess. Her eyes widened, flicking to my son for support, and he shifted uneasily, caught between loyalty to his wife and recognition of my authority. I said nothing. Silence became my weapon. They had expected confrontation, begging, fear. Instead, they received quiet, calculated resistance that cut sharper than any words could. I could feel their plans unraveling, though they hadn't realized it yet. Their assumptions were brittle, their confidence a fragile veneer. I let them fidget, let them squirm in their own expectations, each movement betraying the truth. They had underestimated me, and as I moved to pour myself coffee, slow and controlled, I realized the first cracks were appearing in their carefully constructed facade. They were already in my web, and every decision I made, every pause, every glance would tighten it further. My mind traced possibilities, contracts unsigned, future negotiations, every asset they believed untouchable under their calculations, each a lever for the moment I would act. By the time they recognized the reality, the game would be finished. The house felt alive with tension, a living testament to the quiet war they had triggered against the wrong person. And as I sipped my coffee, slow and deliberate, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I had already begun winning, and the next move would be theirs to miscalculate. By midday, the house felt smaller, each room tighter, every corner echoing the tension I had cultivated with nothing more than my silence and deliberate movements. My daughter-in-law flitted from room to room, arranging decorations and speaking to my son in hushed tones, assuming I could not hear, would not understand, that I would remain passive. I followed quietly, letting the walls carry her words, cataloging every strategy, every expectation, every moment she revealed of her plan. She spoke of selling furniture, reallocating assets, shifting accounts, as if she were already in control, as if the house and its contents were hers to command. I let her talk, nodded occasionally, appearing small and compliant, while inside every syllable sharpened my understanding. Every glance of arrogance they offered became a tool in my arsenal. My son avoided eye contact again, hesitant to correct her, hesitant to assert himself, and I noted the hesitation carefully. It was a weakness I could use, a silent lever that could turn the tide when the time came. They believed I had no awareness of legal documents, of deeds, of contracts, of trusts. They assumed ignorance was the same as weakness, but I knew precisely what each document represented, every clause and loophole cataloged in my mind like a map of possibilities. I poured myself tea, letting the steam rise slowly, letting it mark my deliberate, controlled presence in the room. She asked where a particular set of keys were, reaching instinctively toward the counter. My hand covered them before she could, the subtle pressure letting her know without words. Control here was an illusion, and I held it. I watched her eyes widen, saw the momentary panic ripple through her expression, felt the shift in the unspoken hierarchy. They had assumed compliance. They had assumed fear. Instead, they met quiet authority, measured and patient, a power that could not be bargained with, shouted over, or ignored. I let them digest that reality, letting time stretch, letting tension settle deep into their bones. Every plan they had whispered in my absence, every assumption about my passivity, every word of greed and entitlement had already been neutralized in its potential. And as I moved to the window, looking out at the fading afternoon light, I allowed a faint, controlled smile. They believed the game had begun. In truth, it had already been decided. Every step, every glance, every whispered strategy on their part was now under my silent control, and the reckoning they had triggered in their arrogance was only just beginning to unfold late that afternoon. I moved through the house with deliberate calm, each step measured, each gesture a quiet assertion of presence. My daughter-in-law was in the library, flipping through papers she believed were inconsequential, muttering under her breath about rearranging accounts and assets. I stood in the doorway silently, observing, cataloging, recording every detail. She thought she had privacy. She thought she could manipulate freely, without consequence. I let her chatter, noting every contract she glanced at, every number she whispered, every assumption she made about my ignorance. My son lingered nearby, uncertain, torn between loyalty to his wife and the unspoken understanding of what was truly mine. He watched me, but said nothing. That hesitation, that silence, was a tool I filed away for later. I stepped closer slowly, and she jumped slightly, caught off guard. I did not speak. I did not smile. My presence alone unsettled her, a silent reminder that she was under scrutiny. I let the room absorb her unease before I moved on, casually adjusting a picture frame on the wall, straightening a rug. Small gestures, but ones that reminded them of the boundaries she believed she could ignore, the contracts she thought she could manipulate, the discussions she believed I could not follow, were all logged in my mind. Each detail a thread I could pull when the time came. She tried to mask her panic with a light laugh, but it was brittle, fragile, cracking under the weight of reality she refused to acknowledge. I poured myself water, drank slowly, letting the coldness remind me of the patience required for the next steps. Every movement they had made, every whisper of entitlement, every arrogant glance, they had handed me the power without realizing it. And as I moved through the hallway, each room a stage, each action deliberate, I imagined the next family gathering, the moment when their overconfidence would meet the silent truth of my control. They had started the game thinking it was theirs to win. They had already lost. I allowed the thought to settle in my mind like a shadow across the floor. The house, the wealth, the decisions, they were mine, quietly, patiently, untouchable, until the moment I chose to act. The reckoning was coming, and I would not need to rush. They had built their own cage, and now they would live inside it, unaware of how carefully, silently, I had locked the door. Evening fell, and the house seemed heavier, as if the walls themselves held the tension that had built over the past days. I moved through the living room slowly, deliberately, letting my presence be felt without a word. My daughter-in-law was speaking to my son about plans for the week, her tone casual, but her eyes betrayed calculation. They assumed I could not hear, that I could not understand, that I would remain passive. I did not interrupt. I did not react. I let their conversation continue, cataloging every phrase, every subtle hint of entitlement, every assumption about my absence from the decisions they believed they controlled. They spoke of assets, of investments, of my son's future, as though I were heir, as though their words had no weight. My son's hesitation, the slight tightening of his jaw, his unwillingness to challenge her openly, all revealed the cracks I could exploit. I moved closer, carefully adjusting a lamp, letting the shift in light fall across the table, a subtle reminder that I was watching, calculating, aware. They did not notice the small, deliberate gestures, but the change in the room was palpable, a silent assertion of authority. She mentioned selling furniture, shifting accounts, consolidating holdings, her words sharp, daring me to challenge her. I remained calm, silent, letting each statement sink into the air, weighing on them more heavily than any argument could. My son swallowed, caught between fear of confrontation and recognition of the truth I embodied. Control remained mine, and their assumptions were fragile. I took a seat across from them, not to engage, but to observe each subtle movement, each whispered strategy, each glance a map of their intentions laid bare. I traced every opportunity for leverage, every weakness exposed by their arrogance. I knew that patience would be my weapon, silence my shield, and observation my sword. By the time they realized the trap, the consequences would be irreversible. I sipped my tea slowly, deliberately, letting the warmth anchor me in the quiet chaos of the room. Their eyes flicked toward me now, a fraction of doubt creeping in, barely visible but undeniable. The first seeds of fear, subtle and fragile, had been planted, and as I watched them, unaware that their every word and every move was catalogued and stored for future use, I allowed a small, almost imperceptible smile to form. The game was theirs to believe they controlled, but the reality was clear. I was 3 steps ahead, and each day brought me closer to the reckoning they had unknowingly invited. The next morning, I entered the dining room before anyone else, letting the quiet settle like a weight on the polished table. My daughter-in-law was arranging papers, whispering numbers and plans, confident I was oblivious, that I would not notice how she had overstepped, how boldly she believed she could command my household. I did not speak. I did not react. I let every word land, every calculation sink in. My son hovered near her, uneasy, caught between obedience and recognition of reality. She spoke freely about transferring assets, consolidating investments, and redistributing possessions, as if the house, the wealth, and even my presence were hers to command. I observed silently, noting the cracks in their arrogance, the subtle tremors in their certainty, the arrogance that betrayed their ignorance. I moved around the room, placing a cup just so, adjusting a chair imperceptibly, small gestures that reminded them of my presence and control. They believed they had maneuvered beyond my reach, but I catalogued every misstep, every whisper, every expectation. Their assumptions were brittle, their confidence superficial. I allowed them to believe they had the upper hand, while I calculated how to exploit each flaw. The air between us thickened with unspoken tension, a quiet battlefield where my patience became the most dangerous weapon. I thought of the contracts, the accounts, the legal documents they assumed I would never reference, each one a lever I could pull at the precise moment. I let my gaze linger on my daughter-in-law, watching her excitement and smug satisfaction slowly erode under the weight of the reality she refused to see. She had triggered a silent counterforce. My son remained hesitant, unaware that his passivity had already shifted the balance in my favor. I sipped my coffee, slow and deliberate, letting the warmth ground me while the cold clarity of the situation sharpened my mind. Every gesture they made, every assumption they held, every plan they believed secret had already been noted, recorded, and prepared for use. By the time they realized that their arrogance had created a cage for themselves, it would be too late. I allowed myself the faintest acknowledgement of satisfaction, knowing that each calculated pause, each controlled observation, each small act of quiet dominance was moving the game irrevocably in my favor. The house, the family, the wealth, they believed it was theirs to manipulate. I knew better. The reckoning had begun, and every moment they underestimated me only tightened the net I had silently woven around them. By midday, the tension in the house had grown almost tangible, a quiet storm they could neither see nor control. I moved deliberately through the hallway, listening to my daughter-in-law's voice as she strategized with my son about moving furniture, shifting funds, and reorganizing my estate as if it were theirs. I did not interrupt. I did not react. I catalogued every syllable, every hesitation, every subtle inflection, every expectation they held about my ignorance. They believed I was passive, that I would allow them to dictate every corner of my life, every piece of my property, every detail of my wealth. I let them operate under that illusion, a shadow of compliance I wore like armor, while inside my mind, each whispered plan became a thread in the net I was weaving around them. My son's hesitation, the way his eyes darted to mine before dropping to the floor, revealed cracks in his loyalty and understanding, and I noted it carefully. Each misstep, each arrogance-laden assumption became a tool, a lever, a potential trap. I moved to the library, adjusting a book on the shelf, letting my presence settle like a cold weight behind them. They whispered about investments, about selling shares, about reallocating funds, oblivious to the fact that I knew every document, every account, every clause in every contract that concerned them. They believed strategy resided in their hands. They had no idea the real control had always been mine, silent, patient, unbroken. I let my coffee cool in the cup, sipping slowly, deliberately, each movement a reminder that I observed everything, that I cataloged every plan, every word, every gesture. They were clever, calculating, but predictable, driven by greed and impatience, and those traits would be their undoing. I imagined the moments to come, the next family conversation, the next meeting, the next miscalculation, and I allowed a small, cold smile to settle. It triggered a quiet war, thinking it was theirs to win. They had not realized the battlefield had always been mine to command, and as the day stretched, each room, each corner, each shadow reminded me that they were already inside the web I had spun, moving in ways they believed were free. But every step was directed, accounted for, and destined to serve the reckoning that was coming. Patience had become my weapon, observation my shield, and silence my sword. And soon, every assumption, every whisper, every calculated move they had made in arrogance would collide with the truth they refused to see. The power in the house, in the wealth, in the decisions, had always been mine. Late that afternoon, I entered the main hallway just as my daughter-in-law and son were moving through the house, discussing plans and assets in whispers that they assumed were private. I did not announce myself. I did not reveal awareness. I let them speak, every word landing in my mind like pieces on a chessboard. They discussed the furniture, the accounts, the shares, assuming I would do nothing, that my presence was negligible, that I could be dismissed as a passive observer. My son's hesitation, the subtle flinch when she leaned too far into arrogance, spoke louder than any protest. I noted it. Every glance she cast, every calculation she made, every expectation of my compliance was catalogued, analyzed, filed away. I walked past them slowly, adjusting a vase on the hallway table, the slight movement drawing their attention, a subtle reminder that I was present, that I observed, that I controlled the tempo. They had assumed silence meant weakness. They had assumed patience was ignorance. Instead, they were facing careful calculation, strategic patience, and a mind cataloging every misstep they made. I overheard her mentioning a meeting with a lawyer to finalize what they thought was their control over part of the estate. I did not react. I did not intervene openly, but the knowledge settled in my mind like a weapon in place. Every clause, every contract, every word spoken about transfers and assets was logged. Every assumption they had made about my passivity would soon become their undoing. I poured myself a glass of water and sipped slowly, deliberate, controlled, letting the quiet authority of my presence press down on them without a word. The house itself seemed to shift under the weight of their arrogance, their confidence cracking in ways they could not yet feel. I imagined the next few days, the next series of conversations, and the subtle maneuvers I could make to expose their greed and force their reckoning. They believed control was theirs. They had built their plan on assumptions, about my ignorance. But each assumption was wrong, and I would bend every expectation they had crafted into their own undoing. By the time they realized it, their plans, their arrogance, and their confidence would collapse under the quiet, relentless pressure I had built. And as I moved into the study, every footstep measured, every breath deliberate, I allowed the faintest acknowledgement of satisfaction. They were already trapped in the consequences of their own actions, and the reckoning had only just begun that evening. I lingered in the hallway, listening as my daughter-in-law spoke to my son about shifting accounts and reassigning assets, her voice calm but lined with expectation, unaware that I had cataloged every word, every inflection, every subtle assumption about my ignorance. I did not interrupt. I did not react. I let their confidence fill the space, letting them believe that control rested solely in their hands. I walked slowly past them, adjusting a picture frame so that the light fell just slightly differently on the room. A small gesture, almost imperceptible, yet enough to remind them I was aware, present, and watching. They assumed passivity meant weakness. They assumed silence meant compliance. I let them operate under that illusion, cataloging every plan, every misstep, every assumption, building a quiet ledger in my mind that would dictate the moves to come. My son avoided my gaze, uncertainty flickering across his features as he watched his wife maneuver, caught between fear and recognition of reality. I traced every opportunity for leverage, contracts left unsigned, investments they assumed I had overlooked, financial decisions made in ignorance of my awareness. Each was a thread I could pull, a lever I could use to bend their overconfidence against them. I poured myself a cup of tea, letting the warmth anchor my patience, while the cold clarity of their arrogance sharpened my mind. Every step they took, every word they uttered, every assumption they made about my passivity strengthened my position. They believed the game was theirs to win. In truth, it had always been mine to command. I imagined subtle ways to disrupt their plans, to plant seeds of doubt, to force hesitation, to let the first cracks appear without their awareness. Each tiny, deliberate movement I made, tilting a vase, adjusting a rug, placing a cup, became part of the psychological pressure I exerted. They were already bending to it, though they did not realize it. And as I sat quietly in the study, listening to the house hum with the weight of their arrogance, I allowed a faint, cold smile. They had started a war they did not understand, and the first moves had already been captured. Their greed, their assumptions, their arrogance, all would serve the reckoning I was preparing. And soon, they would have no choice but to confront the truth they had ignored. The next morning, I entered the kitchen before anyone else, letting the quiet settle around me like a tangible weight. My daughter-in-law and son were already there, discussing the upcoming week's arrangements, and as always, assuming I was passive, oblivious, irrelevant. I did not interrupt. I did not react. I let every word hang in the air, each syllable a record in my mind, a ledger of their arrogance, greed, and assumption. They spoke of transferring assets, reorganizing investments, and consolidating furniture, all with the casual authority of those who believe they already control the house, the family, and even me. My son shifted uneasily, avoiding my gaze, his hesitation betraying the conflict inside him between loyalty to his wife and recognition of the truth he could not yet articulate. I observed quietly, cataloging every movement, every glance, every breath, every expectation. When she reached for the keys I had placed on the counter the day before, I let my hand hover over them, just enough to force her pause, to remind her subtly that control had never left me. The moment stretched, fragile and tense, and I could see the flicker of doubt cross her eyes. They had assumed fear and passivity. Instead, they encountered calm, deliberate observation, a silent force they could neither bargain with nor see. I moved through the room, straightening a chair, tilting a vase, letting small, almost imperceptible gestures serve as reminders of who truly held power. Their whispered plans, their overconfidence, their assumptions, they were all recorded, weighed, and filed away for future leverage. I sipped my tea slowly, deliberately, letting the quiet authority of my presence press down on them like gravity, subtle but undeniable. Each conversation, each misstep, each arrogant declaration strengthened the threads of the trap I had quietly woven around them. By the time they realized the true weight of my awareness, the first cracks of panic would appear, and their confidence would crumble. The house itself seemed to echo with tension, a living witness to their miscalculation, while I remained poised, patient, silent, and untouchable. And as I glanced toward the window, letting the fading morning light touch the polished surfaces, I allowed a faint, controlled smile. They had believed themselves in command, but the reality was stark and unyielding. The reckoning had begun. Their arrogance had been captured, and every move they made now only drew them further into the trap they had unwittingly constructed by late afternoon. The house felt like a stage set for a silent confrontation. I moved through the rooms deliberately, letting every step, every gesture, every glance serve as a subtle assertion of my presence. My daughter-in-law was reviewing documents, speaking softly to my son about selling furniture and reallocating accounts, confident in her authority, blind to the fact that her every word was cataloged, analyzed, and stored for use against her. I did not intervene. I did not react. I let her overconfidence bloom, watching how it crept into her posture, her tone, the way she expected compliance. My son lingered nearby, hesitant, caught between loyalty to her and recognition of my quiet dominance, and that hesitation became a tool I filed away carefully. I moved closer, adjusting a vase, tilting a picture frame, small gestures that subtly disrupted the flow of their conversation, reminders of boundaries they assumed did not exist. They whispered about investments, estate transfers, and consolidations, unaware that their assumptions about my ignorance were utterly false. Every document she glanced at, every number she muttered, every plan she assumed I did not notice became a lever, a thread in the net I was weaving around their arrogance. I sipped tea slowly, deliberately, letting the warmth anchor my patience, while the cold clarity of the situation sharpened my mind. They had assumed control, assumed that my silence equaled submission. Instead, my silence carried weight, presence, authority, and strategy. I imagined the dominoes falling, the consequences of every small miscalculation they were making, and I allowed a faint, controlled smile. I was 3 steps ahead. Every assumption they held, every expectation of compliance, every greedy glance at my wealth would soon collide with the reality they had ignored. I had observed, cataloged, and prepared. By the time they realized the subtle manipulations, the first cracks would appear, confidence would fracture, and panic would set in. And as I moved through the hallway, each step deliberate, each breath measured, I understood the inevitable. They had built their own cage, and I was already holding the key. The reckoning was coming, calculated, precise, and unstoppable, and nothing they did now could reverse the trap they had unknowingly stepped into the following morning. I observed them from the study doorway, silent, deliberate, letting every movement and word become part of the record I was building. My daughter-in-law was already orchestrating the day, shifting papers, mentioning accounts, speaking in hushed tones about selling property and reallocating investments, fully convinced of her dominance. My son stood nearby, hesitant, his eyes flicking toward mine, only briefly, before dropping in submission to her narrative. I did not interrupt. I did not speak. I let them believe control had shifted entirely to their hands, while quietly calculating the leverage hidden in their overconfidence. Each misstep, every assumption, every glance they exchanged, every whispered plan became a tool, a thread in a web I had patiently spun. I walked into the room slowly, adjusting a book on the shelf and tilting a frame on the wall, each gesture imperceptible but deliberate, designed to unsettle subtly, to impose my silent authority. They continued to speak of assets, of transfers, of consolidations, oblivious that their words were now weapons I could wield, that every plan they thought secret had already been logged and analyzed. I sipped my coffee slowly, deliberately, letting the warmth anchor my patience while sharpening my mind with the cold precision of strategy. Their arrogance, their greed, their belief in my passivity. They had handed me everything without knowing it. I began planting small, subtle manipulations, a suggestion here, a question there, crafted to seed doubt, hesitation, and miscalculation. My daughter-in-law's confidence wavered ever so slightly, and my son's hesitation grew, both unaware they were reacting exactly as intended. The house itself seemed to pulse with the tension I had created, every room a silent witness to the game unfolding under my control. By the time they realized the subtle influence I had woven into their decisions, every assumption would become a liability, every plan a trap. And as I stood quietly, letting the quiet authority of presence press down upon them, I allowed the faintest, controlled smile. They were moving exactly where I wanted, guided by their own arrogance, and the reckoning that would strip their confidence bare was already underway. That night, I made my first deliberate move, not loud, not visible, precise. While the house slept, I sat alone in the study, reviewing documents they believed were already theirs, tracing names, dates, clauses, and signatures with calm focus. My daughter-in-law had assumed control without understanding structure. My son had agreed without asking questions. That ignorance was costly. I made a single call, short, formal, no explanations. I requested confirmations, delays, verifications they did not know existed. By morning, uncertainty would enter their plans. At breakfast, I watched it happen. My daughter-in-law checked her phone twice, then a third time. Her posture stiffened. She excused herself to take a call, her voice low, controlled, but strained. My son followed her into the hallway. I stayed seated. I stirred my coffee once. They returned quieter, slower. Their confidence had shifted into calculation. She asked me, carefully now, if I remembered signing certain papers. I answered simply, I remember everything. No accusation, no threat, just fact. The room changed. She tried to recover, mentioning timelines, assuming authority, but the rhythm was gone. My son avoided her eyes. He avoided mine more. Silence filled the gaps where certainty used to be. I said nothing else. I didn't need to. They had expected submission. Instead, they met resistance without confrontation, power without exposure. The rest of the day unfolded differently. Conversations paused when I entered rooms. Plans were rephrased. Assumptions softened. They were no longer moving forward. They were reacting. That was the shift I had waited for. Control does not announce itself. It tightens quietly. By evening, my daughter-in-law was pacing. My son sat alone, staring at nothing. The house felt unsettled, as if it sensed the balance changing. I returned to the study and closed the door, knowing the first fracture had formed. They would spend the night questioning what they thought they owned, what they thought they controlled, and how much I truly knew. And as I turned off the light, one truth stayed clear and steady. once fear replaces certainty, collapse becomes inevitable, and I had just introduced it. At evening, the house felt tense, every creak of the floorboards and shift of shadow magnifying the unspoken war that had taken hold. I moved through the rooms with slow precision, cataloging each movement, each glance, each breath from my daughter-in-law and son, fully aware that they had no idea how closely I observed, how meticulously I tracked every plan, every assumption, every overreach. My daughter-in-law discussed selling shares and reallocating funds, her voice smooth but laced with overconfidence, her smirk betraying the arrogance of someone convinced of their dominance. I let her speak, nodded faintly, keeping my own movements deliberate, adjusting a lamp, tilting a vase, minor gestures that unsettled the rhythm of her confidence without seeming intentional. My son lingered nearby, uneasy, shifting his weight, avoiding my gaze, betraying the internal conflict between loyalty to his wife and recognition of the authority they had dismissed. I cataloged every hesitation, every miscalculation, every subtle reveal of greed, and began planting deliberate disruptions. A suggestion here, a carefully timed pause there, a small, innocuous correction, all designed to seed doubt, to test their reactions, to provoke mistakes they believed were hidden. They assumed control, assumed I was ignorant, assumed my silence was weakness. But in truth, every move they made fed the trap I had crafted. I sipped my tea slowly, deliberately, letting each swallow mark the passage of time and the patience that was my weapon. I could see the cracks forming her subtle twitch, his avoided glances, the tiny missteps in their execution. They had underestimated the quiet, observing force I represented, and every overconfident move had now become a liability. I imagined the days ahead, the opportunities to exploit each assumption, to magnify each mistake, and I allowed a faint, cold smile. By the time they realized the web they had stepped into, the consequences would be irreversible. House, the wealth, the family, they believed themselves in command, yet the reality was stark. Every plan they had crafted, every word spoken in arrogance, had been quietly turned against them, and the reckoning they had triggered was already underway, patient, precise, and unstoppable. By late evening, the house carried a quiet, suffocating tension, each shadow seeming heavier than the last, each room echoing with unspoken calculations. I moved deliberately, tracing the paths my daughter-in-law and son had walked, memorizing each footstep, each glance, each subtle gesture of overconfidence. They believed the house, the assets, the decisions were theirs to manipulate, that I remained a passive observer, a naive mother whose presence was negligible. I let them believe it. Every word they whispered about reallocating funds, selling property, or shifting investments was absorbed silently, cataloged meticulously, filed away for later leverage. I adjusted a picture frame, tilted a lamp, small movements that disrupted their sense of control, reminders of boundaries they assumed did not exist. My son lingered near his wife, uneasy, hesitant, caught between loyalty and recognition of the silent authority I wielded. I noted every microreaction, every falter, every twitch of hesitation, every shadow of doubt in their eyes, storing them like ammunition for the moments to come. Then, subtly, I began nudging their plans, planting questions that seemed innocuous, but carried the weight of doubt, hints that suggested mistakes they might be making, errors they had overlooked. My daughter-in-law's confidence wavered in tiny, almost imperceptible ways, and my son's hesitation deepened, both unaware that their reactions were exactly as I intended. I sipped my tea slowly, deliberately, letting each swallow mark the passage of time and my calculated patience. They had assumed silence equaled weakness, ignorance equaled powerlessness, but I had quietly become the engine of the unfolding consequences, the architect of the reckoning they had triggered. Every assumption they held, every plan they believed secret, was already compromised, woven into a trap they could not see. And as I moved through the dim hallway, letting the subtle shifts in light accentuate my presence, I allowed the faintest, controlled smile to form. They were already caught, unaware, and the inevitable collapse of their confidence and control was already underway, precise, relentless, and entirely beyond their comprehension. The next morning, the house felt colder, as if the air itself carried the weight of the tension I had been cultivating. I moved through the living room deliberately, watching my daughter-in-law and son strategize, assuming I remained unaware, assuming my silence was submission. I let them speak, noting every word about accounts, property, and investments, every glance that betrayed entitlement and overconfidence. My son shifted nervously, caught between fear and recognition, his hesitation evident in the tightening of his jaw, the fleeting avoidance of my gaze. I allowed small, calculated gestures, a subtle tilt of a lamp, the repositioning of a chair, the adjustment of a vase, to unsettle them without revealing my awareness. Their whispered plans, meant to assert control, now played out in a space entirely under my observation. I began nudging them indirectly, planting suggestions, posing questions that appeared innocent but seeded doubt and provoked hesitation. My daughter-in-law's arrogance began cracking, subtle tremors appearing in her voice, in her posture, in her confidence. My son's discomfort grew, mirrored in small, unconscious movements, as he began sensing the unseen power I exerted, the silent calculations that now controlled the flow of their actions. Each overconfident step they took, each assumption about my ignorance, strengthened the leverage I held over them. They believed control resided in their hands, but every move they made fed the trap I had woven. I sipped my tea slowly, deliberately, letting the warmth steady my calm, while the cold precision of strategy sharpened my mind. By the time they realized the implications of my presence, the subtle manipulations, the quiet authority I held, the cracks in their plans would have widened irreparably. Panic would ripple through their arrogance, and missteps would compound into consequences they could no longer control. And as I glanced toward the window, watching the dim morning light hit the polished surfaces, a faint, controlled smile formed on my lips. They had underestimated the silent force in the house. Their greed and arrogance had handed me power without a fight, and the reckoning they had set in motion was now just hours away, precise, cold, and unstoppable by the afternoon. The house was heavy with the tension they had created, every room charged with the consequences of arrogance and greed they had assumed would go unnoticed. I moved through the spaces deliberately, observing every twitch, every hesitation, every subtle sign that their overconfidence was cracking under the quiet, relentless pressure I had built. My daughter-in-law's carefully maintained smirk faltered as she realized that every plan, every whisper of entitlement had been catalogued and silently countered. My son shifted uncomfortably, caught between loyalty and the dawning understanding that the house, the assets, and even the decisions he thought were in their control had been quietly steered by me all along. I spoke little, letting small gestures, adjusting a vase, tilting a lamp, moving a book carry the weight of authority. Each movement reminded them subtly that power had never truly left my hands. By now, hesitation and doubt had taken root. The confidence they relied on so heavily was crumbling, and panic flickered behind her eyes like shadows in the corners of the room. I allowed them to see that the quiet patience I wielded was unstoppable, a calculated presence that had observed, absorbed, and prepared for every misstep they had made, every asset, every plan, every scheme they had quietly plotted was now within my control, and the reckoning they had unknowingly provoked had arrived. I sipped my tea slowly, deliberately, letting the warmth anchor my calm, while the cold clarity of truth settled in the room. They were trapped, not by confrontation, not by anger, but by the silent, unyielding strategy I had executed flawlessly over days, turning their own arrogance into their undoing. And as I looked toward them, letting the faintest, controlled smile form, I finally spoke softly, in a measured voice. Please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps stories like this be heard. Thank you. The weight of reality hung heavy in the air. They had believed themselves in command, but it was I who had quietly orchestrated every step, every hesitation, every unraveling of their confidence. The house, the wealth, the power, they had been mine all along. And now the truth was undeniable, irreversible, and complete.